and welcome to Birthright Ballads, a podcast about folksong and memory. I'm Jamie Cook, and today's episode is about the song Divus and Lazarus, and my ignorant understanding of Christianity.
As it fell out all on one day, Divus he held a feast, and he's invited all of his friends and gentry of the best. As it fell out all on one day, Lazarus he was so poor, he came and he laid him down and down by Divus's door. So Lazarus laid him down and down by Divus's door. Some eat, some drink, brother Divus, for to bestow upon the poor. Thou art none of mine, brother Lazarus, lying begging by my door. No meat nor drink shall I give to thee, nor bestow upon the poor.
When I was a teenager, I fell in with a group of friends who were evangelical Christians. I'm aware this isn't the normal route for a troubled youth. These people weren't ruffians leading me down a path of crime and disobedience, drugs and alcohol and gangs and violence that many parents worry about. These people went to church. They went to after-school Bible club, and they spent their afternoons sat around debating the philosophies of such saints as Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. Now, I want to make it very clear, I was not an evangelical Christian. Just because I sang folk songs and dressed in cosy woolly jumpers and I joined choirs, it didn't mean I knew anything about God. When me and my family first started going to folk clubs, I remember the host of one such club, an older folk singer of whom I'm so fond, sidling up to my mum and saying, "So, your family, you're all them Christian folk then, are you?" And my mum replied, "No. What makes you think that?" And he said, "Well, you all seem to like each other." Until then, I hadn't realised that being Goddy was a prerequisite for getting on with your parents. In fact, I'd had the most atheist upbringing imaginable thanks to my folks. I'd never been to a church service, and before then, I hadn't really known anybody that was religious. I went to a non-denominational primary school, and sure, we sang hymns and we said prayers like most days, something I think my parents were quite alarmed at when I told them years later. But honestly, at the time, I didn't really understand that this had anything to do with religion. Like the sweet little boy that I was, I just liked singing, like I do now, and I suppose the prayers were just a harmless bit of gratitude. And again, let me be clear, I'm not saying that constant low-level religious exposure as a child is harmless. I actually think it has the potential to be very harmful to children. I'm just saying that, for me, my personal experience of that exposure was that it went entirely over my head. I was oblivious to what any of it meant. Okay, sure, I guess I had a vague awareness that there was this person called Jesus, and he was a pretty cool guy, and there was this thing called God that seemed fairly important to someone somewhere, but by and large, I didn't separate these tales from the stories that my mum read to me back home, the mid-20th century fantasy that she loved so much, things like The Hobbit, and Grimbold's Other World, and Tom's Midnight Garden, and some of those old religious stories and hymns, they were actually great. I liked the one about the knight riding out against the dragons and giants and ogres. It made me think of the epic Zelda games that I loved to play on our Nintendo 64. I liked the one about Jerusalem amongst the dark satanic mills, which for some reason reminded me of the steampunk city world of my favourite Philip Pullman novels. I liked the one about one more step along the road I go, because I liked the idea of going off on cool adventures through forests and over mountains. And I preferred these old-fashioned ones to the more kiddie, patronising ones about the wiggly waggly worm, or the twee hymns like the one about all things bright and beautiful, which didn't have any monsters in it at all. But they didn't mean anything to me. I didn't know they were something gaudy or that I was supposed to learn something from them. After a hymn session, our head teacher would usually stand up and say a quick prayer, and we would all say Amen afterwards. And for a long time, I genuinely thought that we were saying a person's name, like maybe the guy who wrote those words, and I'd think, who is this Mr. Arman? He gets around, doesn't he? As a little illustration of how oblivious to religion I could be, there was this one time that I was over at my best pal Peter's house playing Lego, as we always did, and his mum came into the room to let us know that she was just off down to church, and I turned to her and said, "Why?" Now, it wasn't like I was at that particularly exasperating age of toddlerdom where every adult's every word is responded to with the word why. No, I think I was probably about 11 years old, and I just didn't understand why this fully grown adult woman was going to church. And so I asked her. And she responded, "Well, it's Sunday, and I usually go to church on Sunday." And I, being the arrogant little shit that I was, responded, "But I thought church was just for children."
Lazarus laid him down and down by Divers's wall. Some eat, some drink, brother Diverus, or surely starve I shall. Thou art none of my brother Lazarus, lying begging by my wall. No meat nor drink shall I give to thee, so surely starve you shall. So Lazarus.
And so, back to that group of Christian friends that I made when I was a teenager. Sometimes I would hear these friends debating an issue and trying to understand their place in the world with regards to God's will, in that righteous and confident way that teenagers do sometimes possess. And I would hear a lot of, the Bible says that, such and such, and I'd think, does it? In particular, I was sort of low-level background aware that there was this whole thing about the Bible saying it wasn't okay to be gay, and this made me feel kind of uncomfortable. I had a couple of gay friends at school. One of them, in fact, was also a part of this Christian gang, and I didn't like the way that their whole love life was scrutinised from some moralising standpoint by some 2,000-year-old text used as a justification that they were evil and going to hell. And anyway, I just wasn't quite convinced that the Bible actually said any of this stuff. And so, being the curious and arrogant little shit that I still was, I decided to make it my mission to know their religion better than they did. A noble cause, I think. Now, I didn't actually want to be involved in it. I still felt weird about going to church, or trying out praying, or anything like that. But the one thing I could do was understand the text. And so I did. I set out to read the entire Bible, Old and New Testaments, and why not throw in the apocryphal books while we're at it, cover to cover, no matter how long it took. And God, I forgot how thin the paper that they print on in Bibles is, and how small the writing is, and how many chapter after chapters there are of such and such begot such and such, who was descended from so and so ad infinitum. But I was committed and I was determined. At the time, I worked in my local cinema, selling popcorn on the popcorn counter. The same cinema where I first saw the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, which is the focus of a previous episode. And this job was perfect for getting a lot of reading done. The work would be busy for 20 minutes or so before a film went in, when everyone came in to get their sweets, and then often for 2 hours or more I would have nothing to do. I mean, I was supposed to go and help out on the bar next door or in the cafe, but the cinema had a lot of good hiding spots and a very comfy sofa and snacks and drinks galore. And so I would settle in for the long haul, popcorn in one hand, paper cup of Pepsi in the other, and the Bible open on my lap. And I would study this strange thing called Christianity that had always lurked there in the periphery of my life. Customers must have wondered what the hell they'd walked in on. Or what the heaven, I suppose. But you know what? I kinda got into it. The Old Testament, especially, is pretty exciting. I mean, let's face it, all the stories you've ever really heard of take place in the first couple of books. The Garden of Eden, Cain and Abel, Noah's Ark, Abraham and Isaac, and, of course, the Sodom and Gomorrah story, the one that so often gets referenced as the biblical justification for homosexuality being a sin, despite seeming to also justify its lead character Lot willfully giving his daughters over to the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah to be raped, and then later, by God's permission, having children by his own daughters because there was nobody else to shag. If this was the justification for persecuting the gays, I was certainly confused. Homosexuality is a sin, but incest and sex slavery, that's fine? There's a couple of other vague allusions to homosexuality being bad in Leviticus, but they're buried in amongst verses about women being killed if they have sex whilst on their periods, so I kinda found it hard to take any of it seriously. After those first couple of books laying the groundwork, introducing the major characters and their grand adventure stories, I definitely started to slow down a bit as I got into the more heavy, meaty bits of genealogy and great long lists of family trees. But there are some real gems hidden in amongst those forgettable books in the middle. I particularly loved the story of Elisha, who is on the road to the town of Bethel when some young boys come out to mock him for his bald head, and so Elisha curses the boys and calls on God to intervene, which he does so in a very reasonable manner, summoning forth 2 she-bears out of the woods, which mauled 42 of the boys. 42! Just for a bit of teasing. I liked the story of Balaam and his talking donkey on the road to Moab, or the story of Eglon, the king of Moab, who was so fat that his assassin lost his sword inside the rolls of his great big belly, and then how his servants failed to come to his aid because they just thought he was doing a poo. I liked the apocryphal stories too, like the story of Tobit the exorcist, who becomes blind after some birds shit in his eyes, but fortunately for him, an angel takes him out fishing one day and shows him how the fish guts can heal his eyesight. And seriously, I'm not here to mock or make fun, although some of these stories are bizarre and seem very daft and funny. But the Bible, like lots of folklore, is confusing and difficult to interpret, and so much has been lost in transmission or in translation. It's like trying to write down a folk song and say, "This is it, this is the definitive version, and all other versions are wrong." Yes, these Bible stories are put into writing, but equally so many of the stories come from older traditions or have other versions told in non-canonical texts, and I don't think you can disregard the centuries of people orally transmitting these tales just because some guy somewhere decided to write it down in a big old book. All of these stories have complex meanings and morals and histories to them. Sometimes they're apparent, sometimes you need to dig for them, and sometimes they just seem lost to the winds of time. As a teenager, I loved trying to interpret the meaning, and I'm sure many a time I interpreted it wrongly, or at least in a less than Christian manner.
So Lazarus laid him down and down by Lazarus' gate. Some eat, some drink, brother died.
different flavours of stories that I read, there was one type that grabbed me the most, and that was the tales of people coming back from the dead. And you know what? I'm not actually talking about Jesus and the resurrection. I mean, that's kind of a given. He's the human embodiment of God himself, and he can do what he likes. No one is particularly surprised that Jesus comes back to life. But I'm talking about the other stories of other people with this power, the less memorable but no less fantastical resurrections. There's an Old Testament story in the book of Ezekiel in which the prophet is brought before a great valley full of dry bones and skeletons, and through God's instruction, he commands them to rise, grow muscle and tendon and skin, and he breathes life into them, a great army of slain Israelites. The number is not specified, but the implication certainly seems that hundreds are resurrected. Although whether they truly live or are some animate form of corpses is quite unclear. It doesn't really say where they go or what they get up to post-resurrection, whether they return to their homes and their families, going about their daily business in their new zombie-like form, or if it's just a temporary arrangement, a trick for Ezekiel to display his prophetic might before they return to the earth again. The next chapter hurries straight on to God and Ezekiel plotting a war against Magog, but they don't appear to make use of their new undead army. If Ezekiel was a superhero, you might say he's a bit overpowered. There's a fantastic New Testament story in the Acts of the Apostles, where Paul is giving a very long sermon to a large gathering of people on the third floor of a building in Troas. A young man named Eutychus is sat on the window ledge listening, but gradually loses interest and nods off to sleep, and as he does so, he takes a tumble out of the window all the way to the street far below. Shocked, the people rush outside to his aid, but they find him dead on the ground. Paul, meanwhile, waltzes out, kneels by the boy's side and embraces him, and through this embrace brings him back to life. Scholars have debated this story, and it is generally agreed that the implication here is not just that Eutychus was stunned and got up again, but that he was actually dead and resurrected. And the most pleasing bit of this story is that Paul takes Eutychus back upstairs and resumes his sermon for several more hours, almost as if to say, "You don't get away that easily, mate."
So diverous he sent out his men for to whip poor Lazarus down. And they have not the power to whip one whip, but they threw their whips to the ground. So diverous sent out his hungry dogs for to bite him as he lay. But they have not the power to bite one bite, they licked his wounds away. As it fell out all on one day, Lazarus sickened and died. There came two angels down from heaven, his soul therefore to guide. Rise up, brother Lazarus, and come along with me, for there is a place reserved in heaven to sit on an angel's knee.
And then, of course, there is the most well-known of the resurrection stories, excluding, obviously, Jesus' own resurrection. And this is when Jesus brings back to life Lazarus. Lazarus was a man from the town of Bethany, whom Jesus knew and loved. In the story, he lies sick and dying, and his sisters, Mary and Martha, they go to Jesus to ask for his help. But by the time that Jesus arrives, Lazarus is already dead. In fact, he has been lying in his tomb for 4 days. The sisters lament the fact that had Jesus come sooner, then Lazarus may yet still live. But Jesus promises that he will indeed live, and the sisters shall see and know that he is the Messiah. And so they all go down to the tomb of Lazarus, roll back the great stone that seals the entrance, and Jesus shouts into the tomb and commands Lazarus to rise and come greet them, which he does. Surprisingly, to say that this is one of Jesus' most impressive miracles, it is told only once in the Gospel of John. Unless, that is, you believe in the secret Gospel of Mark, in which case this story appears twice. In 1958, an American professor of ancient history named Morton Smith discovered a letter in the monastery of Mar Saba near Jerusalem. The letter was an 18th century transcription of a much earlier text written by Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century AD, and in it, Clement made reference to, and even quotes passages from, a longer version of the Book of Mark, which has since become known as the Secret Gospel of Mark. After being studied and photographed, the letter was given to the Orthodox Church in Jerusalem, but sometime in the 1990s they lost it, and now all that survives are the photographs that Morton Smith took. It all seems quite tenuous. A photo of a transcript of a letter about a secret book of the Bible, and it divided scholars as to its authenticity, with some proclaiming it a hoax, whilst others were convinced that it shows a snapshot of a text even earlier than the canonical Gospel of Mark. So here's the bit I find fascinating. The letter is addressed to a man simply named Theodorus, and if we're to assume correctly, it is in response to a previous letter from Theodorus to Clement, in which Clement was asked if it is true that there is a gospel that speaks of the activities between a naked man with a naked man. To which Clement replies by quoting an unknown passage from Mark about the resurrection of an unnamed man who is nevertheless described in a manner very alike to Lazarus, a man who Jesus loved and whom loved Jesus. And the passage goes on to tell how this man then spent a night with Jesus, naked but for a thin linen cloth, and during that time Jesus taught him the mysteries of the kingdom of God. I mean, talk about erotic. And it's not just me that thinks this. Several Bible scholars, including Morton Smith himself, have read into this passage, and others, what they believe could be evidence of Jesus engaging in homosexual sex. Take that, Sodom and Gomorrah. The thing is that it feels like every Bible passage can be interpreted in 100 different ways, and from my very atheist standpoint, I suppose I'm choosing to interpret this one as gay Jesus, for my gay friends that I had as a teenager, who were so bewildered by what the Bible had to say about the love that they felt. It doesn't mean I'm right. It doesn't mean there is a right. I use my own judgment to interpret ancient stories in ways that justify my beliefs. So, in that sense, perhaps my atheism is a sort of faith. I love these stories, and despite my atheism, they are stories I seem to return to time and time again, not least because of the significant presence of religious tales in folk music. Incidentally, Lazarus was quite a popular name a couple of thousand years ago, and the Lazarus of this song is not the same Lazarus who was raised from the dead. They are in fact two different and distinct men in the Bible, both named Lazarus, a point that many people, including I must confess myself, often get confused about. But the stories are in all likelihood connected, it being generally agreed that the Gospel of John was inspired by the earlier writings of the Gospel of Luke. When the rich man Dives pleads from his torment down in hell that the poor man Lazarus be resurrected and returned from heaven back down to earth to warn Dives's brothers against wrongdoing, it's like a little premonition of the resurrection of the other Lazarus story. I like to think of moments such as this like floating verses in folk songs. Someone somewhere has gone, "Hey, that's a good line. I'm gonna pinch that and use it myself." Read what truth you like into it, but a good story is a good story, as a good song is a good song. and that's why they've lasted hundreds, if not thousands of years.
As it fell out all on one day, Lazarus sickened and died, and there came 2 servants all up from hell, his soul therefore to guide. Rise up, brother Lazarus, and come along with me, for there is a place reserved in hell for to rot in purgatory. Then Lazarus he looked up with his eyes, and he saw poor Lazarus blessed. Give me 1 drop of water, brother Lazarus, for to quench my flaming thirst. Come back, brother Lazarus, come down from heaven above. Rise up once more, brother Lazarus, and save our wicked souls.
Thanks for listening to Birthright Ballads, which was written and produced by me, Jamie Cook. You've heard once again from the wonderful Jenny CZ and Max Kieseler. Thanks so much to those guys. If you'd like to hear the full songs and more of the music from this series, then you can find all of the tracks on Bandcamp at birthrightballads.bandcamp.com. Please tell your friends if you've enjoyed the podcast. Word of mouth is the best way to share things around. And if you want to get in touch to say hi or with comments or episode suggestions, I'd genuinely love to hear from you. You can find us on Instagram at Birthright Ballads. And finally, this podcast is free for all to enjoy. But if you want to support the podcast, then you can go to patreon.com/birthrightballads and buy me a coffee if you so wish. Any amount is appreciated. Thanks again, and see you next time.